For over the past few decades, 20 to 40 years, in fact, anytime there was a crisis, a lot of money actually flowed to US markets. It went into US bonds primarily. However, right now we are seeing a big repudiation of US debt. A lot of countries, a lot of investors, they are saying we just don't trust the situation that the US economy is going to. The trade projections, the trajectory of the entire economy under Trump is very unstable. So right now we are seeing a global flight of safety away from the United States, which is very unprecedented.
Well, everybody, I'm really honored to welcome back into the studio Mr. Sean Foo. Sean, thank you so much for joining us again here on Real Talk.
Hey, anytime, man.
We're going to jump right into it because I want to talk about tariffs. We are in the middle of a global trade war. I put on the title there, the global financial crisis, because I do think this is going to affect many, many countries, basically every country around the world. Sean, kind of give us a little update on what you're feeling right now. We're middle of April. We've just, it's actually very hard for us YouTubers because it's every day, it's just changing, right? Donald Trump is flip-flopping back and forth. Give us a little bit of, your opinion over the last couple of weeks.
Well, I think over the last couple of weeks, there's been quite a bit of haphazard trade policy coming out from the Trump administration, right? We have seen a lot of flip-flop going on. We have seen a lot of destruction in the financial markets, and the very fabric of the US economy and the global financial system is unraveling as we speak. One of the biggest indicators out there is just the price of gold. It has gone ballistic. It has gone from like 3,000 all the way to 3,200, which kind of shows that a lot of the ideas of financial safety, I'll put my money in the US economy, into US markets, all those are starting to get challenged. A lot of money is flowing into other safe havens, into the euro, into gold, into other areas, and that really shouldn't be the case. For over the past few decades, 20 to 40 years, in fact, anytime there was a crisis, even if it was manufactured, for example, in 2008, the Great Mortgage Collapse, it was so-called engineered by Wall Street in the United States. But even when that happened, a lot of money actually flowed to US markets. It went into US bonds primarily. However, right now we are seeing a big repudiation of US debt. A lot of countries, a lot of investors, they are saying we just don't trust the situation that the US economy is going to. The trade projections, the trajectory of the entire economy under Trump is very unstable. So right now we are seeing a global flight of safety away from the United States, which is very unprecedented.
Yeah, I think you're spot on, Sean. And I think what's very interesting, actually, I saw a graph earlier this week that was phenomenal. It was actually showing the amount of decline in European tourist visits to the United States, and it's basically across the board. Every single European country, is down 30 to 40% as far as their tourism to the United States. And I had a close business partner of mine that he's based in Norway. He is a manufacturer. We actually did an amazing YouTube video where he owns a factory in China, and he said he's back in Norway, and he said I can confirm that, Cyrus. All of my friends here in Europe, basically everybody has said we've lost trust in the United States for the first time in our lives. And not only that, but we have no interest to visit the United States anytime for the next 4 years. So obviously a very direct shot at Donald Trump right now. Sean, what are you thinking, specifically with these tariffs? Because, I think, that's one thing that I've noticed is that the trust has been eroded, and that's going to take a long time for the United States to get back. This is not something that Trump can just flip back on and say, whoops, my bad. Let's just start over again. There's this volatility has, really caused a lot of chaos to the markets. Love your insights into gold, making sure that that's obviously an interesting correlation that's going up. What do you think about this tariff war specifically between China and the United States? I want to get your thoughts on this, as basically we're locked in in kind of a stalemate, right, with both of the two top economies in the world looking at unprecedented triple-digit percentage tariffs. What is your thoughts on that?
Well, firstly, we need to start on why Trump actually started the tariffs in the first place. We all know that he wants to bring back manufacturing to the United States. However, there is a fundamental problem with doing so. The cost of manufacturing in the US is already absurdly high. And right now, when you place tariffs on the entire world, including China, Europe, and the rest of the world, even if it's just a 10 or 20% flat tax, your cost of production immediately goes up. And when that happens, eventually, as you pointed out, a lot of people will not want to visit the United States because the cost of consumption, when I want to go out, let's say for a normal meal in New York City, it was around $100 back then when I went in 2011. It's probably going to cost $200 easily.
Right.
And when it comes to the trade war, We got to understand that China understands this. They understand that if the US wants to go head to head with China, China's customers are all over the world. The US wants to sell to the rest of the world, but it's not economically viable.
Right.
And even if you want to impose tariffs on the world and force them to lower theirs to, let's say, American cars, American chips, and whatever other American products that can be sold, a lot of people are simply not buying. And you can throw it to the blame of boycotts. I'm sure that's a big factor, but it's just that people can't afford it.
Right.
And in a really weird way, what Trump is doing is actually helping China. So let's just think about it this way. If
Right.
you're an exporter in Germany, you're an exporter in Europe or Asia, and you want to export your stuff to America, and you know that, all right, I still have to face a 10%, 20% tariff. And right now, American consumers, sad to say, sentiment is collapsing. A lot of people just don't have the money. Trump's tariffs are going to raise prices between $3,000 to $6,000 annually. And for the poorest Americans, that's going to be a big hammering down in their budgets. So these countries, these exporters, they will have to eat some of the tariffs themselves, right? Maybe it's 2 to 3 to 5% off the 10%.
Right.
Where are they going to get the cheap inputs? Where are they going to get it from? They're going to get it from China, right? Whether you like it or not, Chinese supply chains are still very efficient and they can pump it out.
Correct.
So if you're sitting in Beijing, you know that, all right, the US wants to punish the world, they're actually punishing themselves. This will actually drive more customers to me because I know other countries want to export to the US, but since I am the low-cost producer, I export deflation to the world, I will win out in the end. And let's also talk about the tariff retaliation. You know, the US went 25%, then it went to 42%, or maybe China went to 100%. It's so hard to keep track of everything. But as we now stand, the US is 142, China is at 125%.
Correct.
And here's the thing that I think many American businesses are starting to feel it, right? The moment you put 100%, especially on US goods, 100% tariff is as good as telling the entire nation, do not buy from the US. And whether it's local Chinese people trying to protect their own sense of well-being, their own national identity, or whether it's just the economics itself, 100% tariff is going to make it untenable to buy anything from the United States. And this is not only just manufactured goods as well. You're talking about LNG. You're talking about US farm exports as well. And all those, unfortunately, are going to get decimated.
Right. No, you're spot on. And I think that's something that a lot of people don't understand. And I'm going to give you an interesting insight from the United States. I was talking to a couple of my neighbors who are in different industries. I'm trying to get a feel for what's happening with this variety of businesses that are here in the United States. A neighbor of mine, he works for an airline, and he said, well, right now we are basically not giving any forecast for the rest of the year as far as our earnings per share. The CEO has come out and said, look, it's going to be so turbulent over the next, few months that we just have no idea how to gauge business because, obviously if the economy goes down, we're not able to just pass all of these costs on to the consumers. So they're just not going to fly as much. That's just going to be the reality. But we start looking at, unfortunately, what I think here, Sean, is very sad here is it's going to be the mom and pop businesses, these small businesses there's so many in the United States that are importing and exporting. I mean, you look at, for example, a tremendous amount of Amazon sellers, where are they getting their products from? They're getting them from China. This is just very unrealistic. And it's funny because we have a message from, people that are very pro-tariff that are just saying, well, we can, if we just put a little bit of effort into this, we can relocate these supply chains back to America. And it's funny because I think people that say that obviously have no experience in manufacturing. They have no ideas about supply chains. And, it's almost like they think they can wave a wand and it's like, oh, bam, now we have an iPhone factory here in the United States. Just like that. Imagine that. But the problem is, even if you could do that, who's going to go work in those factories, right? What American, young person right now is keen to be working in a factory assembling iPhones? What's interesting enough is even in China, young Chinese are not really keen on working in factories anymore. And that's actually why you see very savvy Chinese businessmen starting to go to Cambodia, to Vietnam, starting to export their own manufacturing. And, as you know as well, manufacturing in China isn't that cheap. It's not like it's super cheap labor anymore. That's been increasing every year for the last 20 years. It's not the China of the 1980s anymore, but people manufacture there because of the amazing quality. And that's, I think, what you were really alluding to as far as, why these supply chains are so integrated, they're so advanced, and it's truly incredible just how much China supports the world and really exports to the world.
Yep, exactly. There's a lot of supply chains disruption that's going to be done, that's happening, and that's going to happen as well. Now, let's also not forget that when Trump imposed his big tariffs to the world, he conveniently left out services as well. Most of the punishments to the world comes in manufactured goods, right? And we do know that the US has a very big trade deficit when it comes to manufactured goods. But if we look at how developed economies actually grow, most of the time they have to climb the value chain sooner or later. As we speak, we know China has so-called laws, or they have transferred a lot of their manufacturing, supply chains to Vietnam.
Right.
Vietnam is now manufacturing all the shirts, all the shoes, and
Right.
eventually they'll climb up the value chain themselves. The United States is one of the most advanced economies in the world. There's a reason why the tech giants are so big, why
Right.
they are, and why everyone, including me and you, we use YouTube. That is a US company product as well,
Right.
right? And that is a kind of product that you can scale technically infinitely without much cost. And this is where I think Trump really underestimates the US economy in that aspect. But he also knows that he doesn't want to impose tariffs on services. So the US might get impacted if countries like the EU and China decides to retaliate back on that.
Right.
And if we look at the technological progress on China, we have seen that they can manage without YouTube. They can manage without Google. After all, it's more or less non-existent there.
Correct.
And China has a lot of technological products, for example, cloud computing. They can always fight with some of the tech giants out there, fight with Microsoft, fight with Cloudera. China has their own Alibaba Cloud, Ali Cloud as well.
Right.
And if we come to a very challenging situation where the Europeans need to choose, chances are they might actually dump all the products from the tech giants as well. They could just move all the way to Chinese computer solutions. And that won't be good for the United States.
Right. No, I think you're spot on, and I think that's what's interesting is when we go back to this trade war in 2018, and Donald Trump was targeting specific industries, obviously, very clear from the Trump administration, followed by the Biden administration as well, that they wanted to contain China. They didn't want to see China rise. Joe Biden famously said, we don't want to see a world where China is better than us. We need to contain their growth. But this is all just accelerating China's growth and investment and development in these industries, and that's what we've seen is just an incredible development from that 2018 when the initial trade war started with China. But we've seen China double down. They've gotten better. They've improved. They've started making their own technology. They have they're leading the world in microchip research and development. They're not quite at the American level yet, but the progress that they've made in the last 5 years alone is truly fantastic. It's just unbelievable. We saw the DeepSeek, absolutely coming in and changing the future of AI. And like you said, I love that. We always hear like YouTube and Google, fantastic platforms. Both you and I are very familiar with that, use them every day. But what's amazing is that China has their own equivalent, and they're great. And I think what we're seeing right now, I like that you brought in the European angle as well, is I think if we have Europeans, again, looking at that graph and seeing how many Europeans are now losing trust in the United States, not wanting to go, I think you're going to start to see them start to pivot as well and really start to do more business with China. We've seen, for example, the German foreign minister of trade came out and said, if we are involved in a tariff war, there's one place that we can pivot, and that would be to actually get closer with China and increase our trade with China. And I think that's a big loss for the United States, because so much of this problem is just a self-inflicted wound. Would you agree with that, Sean, that this is just really just a unprecedented, different financial crisis, because there's not an event that's really causing this other than just the policies of the president?
Right, exactly. I think you calling it a self-inflicted wound is a very apt description about it, right? Now,
Right.
what Trump wants to do technically is not wrong. He wants to
Right.
bring back some manufacturing to the US. He wants to lower the budget deficit. He wants to make Americans more prosperous. He wants, generally to reduce the homelessness rate and reduce poverty as well. However, he's going about it too fast and furious. He's trying to reverse 40 to 50 years of mistakes into just 4 to 5 months. Or
Right.
even 4 to 5 years. This is impossible.
Right.
There's a lot of things that are broken with the American system that needs fixing. For example, you could always go back and fix the budget deficits first. It's not inconceivable to really lower down your expenditures from $1.9 trillion that you have to borrow, slowly reduce it down. And the way to really fight a tariff war, in my opinion, let's say you want to go head to head with China, it's not to use all these protectionist measures, it's to really build up the education base that you have in your own country, is to go out to the world, not be protectionist, go out to the world and carve very good trade deals with them, go out like China, go to areas in Africa, build up their communities, build
Right.
up the mines, and over time, over decades, then you'll be able to secure some supply chains in a long-lasting way. Then to go out there and try to tell Denmark that Greenland is ours. No, this kind of so-called hostile words isn't really very good for United States. And speaking of the budget deficits, when you are trying to wage so-called an economic confrontation with China, it's also very important on how you spend it as well, right? China, as we all know, has a $1 trillion trade surplus, and they're going to continue subsidizing their economies, their industries. It's just how the world has evolved into.
Right.
That's why when we look at Biden's semiconductor approach with China, one half of it is good, one half of it is terrible. Now,
Right.
the terrible part is splitting the world into different tiers, right? Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3.
Right.
Only Tier 1 countries will give you chips. I mean, that really reeks of some kind of weird colonialism in a sense. However, the other part makes sense. You give countries incentives, you give your companies subsidies to actually lower the cost of production
Right.
so as to kickstart the economic engine. So in a sense, the US is really pulling on both ends of the spectrum, and it seems to be very bifurcated as we go on.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Couldn't agree more. And I think there's a lot of there's a lot of misunderstanding with Trump's delivery, because obviously Americans. I'm amazed by this, Sean. But when I talk to Americans, it's incredible how the vast majority of Americans don't understand what a tariff is. They have no
Right.
idea how these work. They have very little understanding of how the economics, but yet they've been fed this propaganda from Donald Trump and his administration. For example, that this trade imbalance, right? This trade surplus is actually a huge threat. And there's actually an interesting tweet I've got here from Peter Schiff. I'm just going to read this out. He says Trump claims that China's trade surplus means they're ripping us off, but Germany, the Netherlands, Russia, India, Vietnam, Malaysia, Singapore, Australia, Brazil, Peru, Chile, Uruguay, and South Africa have a trade surplus with China. Therefore, these countries are ripping off China. So it's such an interesting tweet, because by this logic, you can manipulate people's perception. It's like, hey, China's been ripping us off. They've been ripping us off. But again, we have to go back to the basics. Like you said, it's many American companies going to China for not just 4 or 5 years, but for decades, right? This is something that has been built up for 40, 50 years. Look at Apple, for example. I love to use the iPhone comparison, because I've seen some amazing claims from people saying that, we could easily build iPhones inside the United States. And then you see some articles that say, yes, if we actually manufactured an iPhone 100%, all the parts, manufacturing, everything from A to Z in America, it would cost over $30,000, because we just don't have the supply chains. We don't have the parts. We don't have the materials, the raw materials. We don't have the tooling engineers. So that's how much an iPhone would cost. And that's not a typo or an exaggeration. So it's just amazing how people don't understand that, but yet we can buy an iPhone for a reasonable price because we have the advanced tooling engineers in China. Apple has spent tens of billions of dollars building up those supply chains and really moving everything there. I mean, I think it's just incredible, the messaging that's coming from the White House, and how still a lot of people are very unclear about just what a tariff is and how it works.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, when it comes to who pays for the tariffs, there are two arguments about it, right? Trump is definitely pushing the narrative that the exporters will eat the tariff. And that's what Scott Bessent has said many times before as well. However, it depends on country to country and industry to industry. And let's
Right.
just take Vietnam, for example. When you are manufacturing shoes, when you are manufacturing t-shirts, when you are manufacturing shoelaces, your margins are razor thin. You're
Right.
looking at anywhere from 5 to 20%. And I'm
Right.
being very generous here.
Right.
So what happens if you throw in a 46% tariff? This will just destroy the entire economy, which is currently built on manufacturing stuff and exporting it to the United States.
Right.
That's why we are seeing a big scrambling from the Vietnam officials running to the US. And even if the US wins this round, what is that going to foster? That's going to foster more resentment over time. And
Right.
as value goes up the value chain, they're going to look to other companies, sorry, other countries to sell to. They're going to sell more to China. And if we actually look at what Peter Navarro said about Vietnam looking for sanctions tariffs reliefs, he said that we don't really care that Vietnam is going to reduce their own tariffs to 0%, because at the end of the day, the end goal is all those exports from China flowing to Vietnam being used and then re-exported to the United States.
Right.
You can see a bit of a concerted effort that, sure, maybe some of the tariffs is to lower your reciprocal ones as well, but maybe a bigger agenda is to contain China. But if the US goes on with this plan, they're just going to push more countries to the hand of China, which really isn't good at the end of the day, because you are losing a lot of confidence from people around the world. And let me touch a bit on the devastation in the financial markets as well,
Yeah.
especially when it comes to the dollar, when it comes to the US debt market, right?
Perfect. I was going to go there next. Yeah, this is great.
Yeah. So we all know that the United States dollar, the USD, is the world reserve currency, right? For many reasons. One of the big reasons is for global trade. Everyone in the world, 70 to 80% across the world, once you aggregate it out, they use the US dollar to buy stuff and to sell stuff. And a
Right.
big portion of it is the Americans buying things, and they obviously pay with dollars, right? So what happens when Trump slaps a 10 to 20% global tariff in the world? The effective rate of the US tariff now is at 25%.
Right.
We can effectively say 20% to 25% of people will drop their consumption down.
Right.
So right now, suddenly you have like 25% of outflow of dollars dropping. Trade is forever fractured. Countries do not have the ability to trade the US anymore. Hence, the demand for US dollars has dropped.
Right.
And on the converse hand, we have China going out there and saying, all right, we'll trade with you, and you only need to pay either using your local currencies and using your the Chinese RMB as well.
Right.
So what does this do? It hammers on the dollar even further. And we can actually see that happen in the dollar index itself, the strength of the dollar. As every time when there's a crisis, as we mentioned before, the US dollar normally rises. But over the last 7 days, he has crashed from 105 or maybe 110 below 100, is now sitting at 99 or so. And
Right.
this is really a big crisis when it comes to US consumers, the United States as a whole. And let's not forget that while Trump likes to tout the idea of a stronger dollar, that's why a weaker dollar is good for US exports, that's true. However, the state of US manufacturing is still not fleshed out, it's still not built. A lot of consumption is actually being imported in. So if the strength of the dollar continues to drop, what does this mean? It just means the cost of consumption and manufacturing in the United States continues to go up. And that is far from ideal.
No, fantastic insights. Sean, I want to ask a little bit about the bond market.
Right.
Tell us a little bit about your thoughts about this, because we're also seeing an interesting correlation with these tariffs and affecting the bond market. Tell us more.
Sure, it all boils down to the US trade with the world going down. As you said,
Right.
the flow of dollars starts to go away, and countries, they decide to trade amongst themselves, they decide to de-dollarize, and suddenly there's very little need to hold US dollars. So there
Right.
are two arguments to see about it. One
Yeah.
is the trade side of things. I'm a country, I'm an exporter, I'm a company, I do not need to hold my stash of dollars anymore, right? So the bond market suddenly becomes unstable because people just don't want to buy the bonds. And secondly, we need to look at the overall confidence of the US economy actually collapsing. And that can be tied directly to the US dollar. Now, Cyrus, when you and I, when we buy bonds, we simply want two things: for the value of the US dollar not to move, especially if
Right.
you're a foreigner, right? Because when you convert the dollar back to your local currency, you want to have a one-to-one so-called matchup with it, and you gain the 3-4% yield every time the year go by. So you clip those coupons, you get the benefit from the bond yields. However, what have we seen over the last 7 days? The dollar has been extremely volatile.
Right.
And if you're an exporter, you're like, I don't know whether I should even hold dollars. Even if I gain a 3% earnings from the bond yields, if the dollar falls by another 5%, I'm in the red. I lose money.
Right.
So right
Right.
now you have investors, you have exporters, you have countries, and you have speculators as well. People on Wall Street, they just don't want to touch US bonds. And we are in such a hyper financialized system that everything is pegged to the US bond market.
Right.
The benchmark rate in the US today is actually the 10-year yield. everything revolves around it, whether it's your mortgage loans, whether it's your car notes, and whether it's your credit card payment interest rates. And if that starts goes up, everything gets repriced up. Consumers, they won't have enough money to spend. Companies, they won't be able to borrow money to expand their operations or maybe even pay their employees.
Right.
So the bond market is a very accurate barometer of trust in the US economy. As yield starts to goes up, it really shows that confidence is actually plummeting down.
Yeah, and I think also, Sean, I mean, we're seeing the VIX index, which is the volatility and just how much fear is in the market. Is hit a new record. I think there's actually more fear right now in this market than there was even during the 2008 financial crisis, which is just truly outstanding. Again, kind of going back to that main point that I want people to understand is that this is really a self-inflicted wound from Trump because it's his policies that have literally caused this global financial crisis. But Sean, what's interesting is we saw a very big flip-flop. We talk about these constant changing. I mean, it's very hard to keep up because we've seen this escalation and this retaliation from China. There's 2 points I want to make. Number one, I think the first thing is dealing with Chinese culture. China
Right.
is the one country in the world that could actually stand up to Donald Trump and his bullying with other tariffs. For example, I lived in Canada for 5 years, and the Canadians and the Canadian economy, it just has no scale. I mean, there's no scale that could possibly compete. So unfortunately, they're under the mercy of the United States government. And if the United States is going to hammer them with tariffs, they're going to have to come to the negotiating table and just say, what do you need from us? What are we going to do? We have to basically play ball and you control. And we're seeing a very different approach from China because they know they have leverage, right? They have tremendous amount of leverage. And then so I think there's also a Chinese cultural element here because if you do business in China, you're never going to get far if you're trying to bully a Chinese person or you're trying to get a deal by threatening. That's basically a surefire way to not get a deal and basically be screwed out of a deal. So I think what we've seen, which is quite incredible over the last week here, Sean, is Washington reducing its tariffs on dozens of Chinese goods. Again, it was up to 145%, but they're selecting very key industries. I'll just read them off here. I mean, this is phones, computers, electronic chips, televisions, and even solar panels now all being reduced from that 145, which is crazy, down to 10%, which is obviously a much more reasonable number. I'm thinking that maybe Tim Cook and Apple. I'm thinking some of the other maybe Michael Dell from Dell Computers. Some of these very, very prominent American businesses probably started to tell Trump, like, you are playing with absolute fire that's going to melt down this economy unless you pivot. Very long-winded question here, but do you think this is the beginning of Donald Trump really trying to pivot, trying to save some face, and really realizing that he's making a big mistake?
Well, I think he's definitely doing that. Remember when they first did the big flip flop, when they paused the 90-day, when they did the 90-day pause on all the global tariffs, what did we
Right.
see? Scott Bessent came out and said this was exactly as planned to show the world that China is a bad actor, and we have actually goaded them into that position. We all know that's just a baloney, right? It's not
Right.
true. It's just
Right.
them trying to save face. And now we have Trump rolling back on the electronic goods tariffs, as you said. Right now, it's just like 10 or 20%. So
Right.
that's definitely Trump trying to save face in front of his voter base, trying to show the world that maybe he has a bigger plan, or maybe he just wants to protect certain US industries.
Right.
But we need to understand that the damage has already been done. A lot of trust has already been lost, and the world as a whole is already starting to stand up. I mean,
Right.
you have talked about Canada being under their mercy, and what's very interesting is that they themselves are starting to push back with their
Right.
own tariffs of around 20 to 25%. Even the EU, before Trump did a 90-day pause, they were about to roll out a 20% tariff as well.
Right.
And in China's case, you have to understand that the US and China's economy, they are very intertwined. And if Trump decides to push his agenda and China does nothing, there's going to be no end to Trump's escalation of demands. It's going to be a tariff today. It's going to be TikTok tomorrow.
Right.
Next is going to be American farmland that Chinese owns. Then we're going to talk about the US treasuries. Maybe Trump wants China to buy a 100-year bond of $1 trillion with zero coupon so
Wow.
that they have the ability or they have the privilege to sell to the United States. So all these interconnected parts actually feed together. What has Trump actually done? He has made the situation by Biden even worse. Unfortunately, this is the situation. A lot of countries right now, they are just looking to diversify away.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a great tweet that I saw from Ian Bremmer, geopolitical analyst. He said, 10 days after Liberation Day, Trump's tariff policy is more about undermining U.S. credibility than reshoring or revenue creation. And I think that's a very brilliant statement there because, again, it just shows you, I think, in my opinion here, Sean, I think that we have a White House administration that just does not have a clear roadmap of really what they want to do. I like what you said, that you said, in theory, there's some good parts of what Trump wants to do, right? Like, let's bring back manufacturing. Let's improve the quality of life for Americans. These are kind of nice things to say. Like, yeah, I think all Americans can get on board with that. Sure, we'd love to have more jobs here. We'd all love to be more prosperous. But I think what the one speech that was really revealing to me was when Vice President J.D. Vance had said that
Right,
globalization had been a complete failure. And, it was very interesting insight because he said it's been a failure because the rich countries, we were supposed to keep getting, richer, while the poor countries basically just stayed at the bottom and just kept manufacturing for us. But like you said
right,
earlier today, right? Like Vietnam, right now, they're experiencing a boom of manufacturing, but in a few years, they're going to start moving up the value chain, and that's a good
exactly.
thing, right? I mean, we should be living in a world where all countries get to prosper, all countries get to raise their standards of living, and I certainly wouldn't want to separate us into tiers, into this kind of colonialism, like you had said, where okay, United States and Singapore, our two countries are tier one, but
Right,
we're gonna look down at tier two and tier three, and hopefully these tier three just stay poor, that way they can
right,
manufacture our stuff. There's not a kind way to go about it. I mean, we should all be trying to get better. And I think that's where you've seen China, like you said, one of the things that they've done well is obviously investing in other parts of the world. You see China's footprint in Africa. There's a very big reason why China is the future of Africa. There's a saying, the future of Africa is China, and the future of China is Africa. And that's
right,
not something that happened overnight, right? That's something that's been
right.
in development for over 20 years.
There's a fundamental disconnect between how Trump is going about his trade policy and how China is going about their daily business.
Right.
As we said, right, China is pro globalization. And
Correct.
if we look through history, how do great powers actually rise? They rise through globalization. Now, obviously, the British did it in a very weird way for going around the world forming colonies, but that was a way of globalization. And the United States, after World War II, they also went around globalizing the world, but they did it through a mixture of trade, the US military, as well as the US dollar. So it was a mixture of all these three. Now, the way China does it is a little different. They don't really care about invading any countries or setting up multiple bases every corner of the world. They just want to go there, help countries build up, as a consequence, have big footprints in their supply chains to secure their global trade. And that's how China's doing it.
Right.
But as we said, as you mentioned, it's going to take years, it's going to take decades, it's going to take trillions of dollars. And let's not forget, from the year 2000, maybe all the way even until 2020, Chinese people, they were living under so-called below their means, right? They were saving, they weren't really spending a lot, they were being very thrifty. However, in the US, it was boomtown Charlie, especially for a selected few, a selected protected group that really didn't so-called redistribute the wealth or have enough safety nets for people, in the Rust Belt. For example, the jobs in the Rust Belt, whether it's steel manufacturing, whether it's making cars, those unfortunately are never going to come back in mass quantities, right?
Correct.
Maybe you can get 5% or 10% of them back. However, you'll still be selling within the ecosystem of the United States itself. So costs will all jack up for everyone. However,
Right.
your key industries, your shining beacons on Capitol Hill, for example, the tech giants, Google, Meta, all those are now under risk. If China decides to retaliate, if the world decides, hey, we're not even going to use their services anymore, we're going to scale
Right.
back, and we are going to take the pain for the next 30 to 40 years, right? We'll build our own tech giants. And if that happens, what's going to happen? The US will lose one of the few fundamental advantages they have left.
Right. Yeah, it's incredible. I mean, I think Sean, this is going to be very interesting to see play out in the future. I want to I'm going to shift here a little bit more to the future now and kind of get some
Right.
predictions. Obviously, very hard to do, but we're going to try to do it here. My first question here, Sean, is we've seen this electronics industry. Things like the computers, the chips, the cell phones. That's actually the largest sector of actual imports from China into the United States. So that is about 22% roughly. So you can see very logically why Trump made that the first one that he started to exempt. Do you see a continuation of this? Do you see that we're going to, potentially, Trump basically start to peel back piece by piece until we get down to a more reasonable tariff level, just because the United States is so dependent economically on China?
Yeah, I think that's going to happen, right? I mean, we are going to revert back to a world of firstly base tariffs on everyone. I don't think Trump is going to back down on that. Whether it's
Right,
1% or whether it's 10%, it's going to happen. Now,
right,
firstly, to satisfy a mixture of his own ego as well as his voter base, right? So at
yeah, for
least he can
sure,
plant the flag and says that the world has to eat a 5% tariff.
right,
And the world will just roll their eyes and they'll go on with business as usual.
correct,
Now, secondly, the US and Chinese economy can never decouple forever in a sense. Even though this goes on, there'll still be fringe amount of trades going on, like how Trump was forced to backtrack on the electronic tariffs. But going forward, we will just see a huge wave of nationalistic production coming from China and the rest of the world.
right,
Now, China, they look at this and they say that, all right, Trump is very mercurial. But as we have seen over the last 4 years, it just gets worse and worse. We thought the devastation from the Russia Ukraine war was done. No. What do we have? We had the Middle East conflict breakout, right?
right,
Confiscations from the assets happened to the Russian reserves. Was it all? No. Now we have the tariff war. So there's no
right,
saying who will come after Donald Trump. Will it be better? We all hope it will be better, but chances are it might not. So if we come back to the situation about the Chinese economy, we can see that they're going to do two things to really future-proof their economy. They're going to launch a lot of stimulus. They will have to move away from an economy that produces a little too much into an economy that consumes more. And
right,
secondly, we can forget about China stopping any technology progress for anyone. It doesn't matter if it's the Americans, whether it's the Europeans, whether it's the Africans, whatever. China, they're going to continue progressing all the way forward. So we can expect sooner or later, within the next 5 to 10 years, we're going to see competitive chips. And once China reaches technological breakthrough, they're going to use their entire ecosystem to slam the prices down. And once that happens, I guess it's going to be quite predictable, right? The American, the Western response will be to push everything back, and we'll be back having this same conversation in the
right.
next 5 years.
Yeah, that's a great prediction for the future. Well, Sean, I think that's a great way to end it there today, because I think we've touched all the bases that I wanted to discuss, and I just want to say thank you so much for coming on the show and sharing your insights. If you haven't already, we're going to put the links to Sean's YouTube channel down below. I know your channel is growing fast, Sean. It's always a pleasure to get your insights, and I don't think this will be the last time, because I think the Trump, tariff war is here to stay for the foreseeable future. What that evolves into, and whether there's reduced tariffs. One thing I know is that China is in for the fight. They definitely are going to fight this, and that they are going to, hopefully come to a resolution, because, like you said, the U.S. and the Chinese economies are certainly connected, and there is no way to really 100% decouple, for either country, because
Right.
they are so interconnected. And honestly, the United States and China, I think if they can find a way to win, that's actually going to be a net positive for the world. And that's something that I certainly hope that we can do. So, Sean, I want to just say thank you again for coming on the show. And we look forward to seeing you in our next interview soon.
Sure, Cyrus. Thanks for having me.